Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us for the first time, or, well, even if you're a long-time listener, you already know what we do here. We take a stack of sources, articles, historical texts, research papers, and we extract the raw mechanics, the foundational concepts that actually explain how our world works.
And the material on the table today, it requires a massive cognitive pivot. I mean, we are looking at Lecture 1013 from the Tulu-e-Islam Digital Audio Archives.
Right, and for you, listening right now, consider yourself the crucial third mind in this room. We really rely on your curiosity to drive this whole intellectual exploration.
Absolutely. So for some context on the source, Tolu Islam, which translates roughly to the resurgence of Islam, was a movement and an archive of thought spearheaded by a 20th century thinker named Ghulam Ahmed Parvez.
Yeah, he was operating in an era of just massive geopolitical upheaval, right? Particularly around the end of British colonialism in India.
Exactly. And Parvez is fascinating because his entire project was essentially to rescue the Quran from centuries of medieval mysticism and, traditional theology.
He basically argued that the text had been completely misunderstood by clerics. Like, they turned it into a book of spells or just moral platitudes.
Yeah, a book you revere but don't actually use. Instead, Parvez read it through the lens of a socio-economic charter.
Which is such a wild paradigm shift. So our mission for this deep dive is to adopt that exact lens. We are putting away any religious sentimentality today.
Leaving it entirely at the door.
Exactly. We are putting on the hard hats of master sociologists and systems engineers. We're going to read Surah Al-Hajj, Ayat 56 through 66, purely as a manual for civilizational survival.
I love that framing. It's essential, really. Think about how humanity generally interacts with ancient, revered texts.
Like museum pieces, usually.
Right. We tend to treat them like a beautifully framed blueprint for the first computer. We hang it on the wall, we admire the typography, maybe we memorize the strings of code and recite them at gatherings.
We treat the physical paper with absolute reverence. But nobody actually builds the computer.
Nobody ever plugs it in.
Yet the utility, the immense power to route data and build a network is entirely lost in the veneration. That is the tragedy of a functional manual being turned into an idol.
And that's exactly what Parvez argues happened to this text. So today, we are stripping away the dogma to look at the raw mechanics of the argument.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to pull the first thread from verse 65. The operative Arabic phrase Parvez isolates here is sakara lakum.
Which translates to, he subjected to you.
Right. The verse states that everything on the earth, the ships that run upon the sea, and the sky itself, are subjected to humanity. Now, the traditional reading of that is usually a passive sense of awe.
Yeah, like, look at this magical gift the divine has graciously given us.
Exactly. But Parvez takes it in a highly technical direction, doesn't he?
He really does. To understand why this is such a huge paradigm shift, we have to look at the historical baseline of human civilization. I mean, early humans worshipped nature out of sheer terror.
Because they couldn't control it.
Right. The sun, the storm, the ocean, these were terrifying, chaotic forces. Because early societies didn't understand the mechanics, they anthropomorphized them into pantheons of temperamental gods.
Gods that constantly needed to be appeased with sacrifices. Like, you pray to the sea god so your boat doesn't sink.
Precisely, and that is exactly the mindset this text is trying to dismantle. Verse 65 posits that nature is not a collection of deities, it is a strictly law-bound system.
It's an operating system waiting to be decoded.
Exactly. When the text says the universe is subjected to humanity, it implies that the physical world will yield to the human mind, but only once that mind understands the underlying code.
I want to really dig into the physics of this because Parvez uses the analogy of the sea and the ships. And this grounds the whole philosophy for me.
It's a brilliant analogy.
Think about a massive steel cargo ship. We're talking about a vessel that weighs 100,000 tons, loaded with heavy machinery, and it's floating perfectly on the ocean.
Defying gravity, seemingly.
Right. Meanwhile, if I drop a tiny iron sewing needle into that exact same ocean, it sinks instantly to the bottom.
Like a stone.
If survival on the sea was just about divine favoritism or, magic, the needle should float too.
But the sinking of the needle and the floating of the massive dreadnought are governed by the exact same objective law: fluid dynamics and buoyancy. Archimedes' principle.
The ship displaces a volume of water equal to its own weight.
Right. The text is pointing out that a ship runs upon the sea not through a continuous string of momentary, localized miracles. It runs because the sea operates on an unbreakable command.
An objective physical law.
Yes. And when human beings study that law, calculate the displacement correctly, and engineer a vessel that perfectly aligns with that mathematical reality, the sea has absolutely no choice but to carry the ship.
It's the ultimate validation of applied reason. The sea is subjected to the human mind because the human mind reverse engineered the sea's physics.
You don't pray to a Python script to make it run, right? You learn the syntax.
That is exactly it. And the brutal flip side is also true. If you build a ship that violates the laws of displacement, the ocean doesn't care how pious your crew is.
No, it really doesn't.
It doesn't care how many rituals you performed before setting sail. The ocean will sink your ship because you violated the objective code.
It's ruthlessly objective. And the lecture extends this to the phrase where it says, God holds the sky from falling on the earth.
Yeah, let's touch on that.
Parwes strips away the imagery of a giant invisible hand physically propping up a ceiling. He interprets this as pointing directly to the invisible, unyielding laws of astrophysics.
So gravity, orbital mechanics, atmospheric pressure.
Exactly. The planets maintain equilibrium because the system is perfectly balanced by physical laws. The overarching argument here is that nothing in the physical universe is off-limits to human mastery.
Provided a society dedicates its intellectual resources to discovering the mechanics. Okay, so the physical universe is legible. It's a puzzle we can solve.
And we have, to a large extent.
Right. If we crack the physics, we get to split the atom, fly airplanes, sail oceans. But this immediate triumph of reason hits a massive wall when we look at human interaction.
Oh, absolutely.
Physics is clean. Sociology is incredibly messy. If the physical world runs on these objective, unbreakable laws, how does this framework evaluate the social world?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because everyone claims their specific worldview is the correct one. How do we measure truth in human ideology?
That transition from physical laws to social laws is where Parwes' analysis of verses 62 and 63 becomes absolutely critical. He addresses two foundational Arabic terms, al-haq, which is standardly translated as truth, and al-batil, translated as falsehood.
But he refuses to let them remain philosophical abstractions, right?
He defines them operationally as working concepts.
Which is totally necessary because in common usage, when a group says we possess the truth, it's purely rhetorical. It usually just means our historical tradition is older or our philosophical argument feels more logically sound.
Right. It doesn't usually come with a measurable metric. But Parwes looks at the etymology. The root of haq implies something that is established, solid, and fits perfectly into its groove.
Like a socket fitting a joint.
Exactly. So in a sociological system, al-haq is that which is constructive, productive, and aligns with the universal laws of human development.
And al-batil.
Al-batil is friction. It is the inert, the unproductive. It's an ideological operating system that, when installed in a society, yields zero real-world flourishing.
The lecture brings in this metaphor of rain from verse 63 to illustrate this, and I think it provides a fantastic key performance indicator, a KPI for society.
It really does. It grounds it.
The verse talks about rain falling on barren, dead, cracked earth. The water hits the soil, and suddenly the earth turns green and vibrant. It's a visible, undeniable output.
And Parwes uses that natural mechanism to establish an empirical test for sociological reality. Truth is tested exactly like a scientific hypothesis.
So it's not about who has the best rhetoric.
Not at all. It asks, does your proposed socioeconomic system, your laws, your economic distribution, and your justice system take a fractured, starving, quote-unquote, dead society and bring it back to life?
Does it produce human security, intellectual growth, and equity?
Yes. If you implement your ideology and the population remains impoverished, heavily stratified, and exploited by an elite class, then your system is batil.
It is demonstrable false.
Regardless of how beautifully your clerics or politicians articulate its doctrines.
It's ruthless pragmatism. The reality of the system is entirely judged by its output. And Parwes uses a very sharp example to drive this home.
The factionalism example.
Yeah. He looks at various religious and ideological factions that all loudly claim to possess the ultimate absolute truth. He points out that if you look at their output, if these groups are so internally fractured that they constantly splinter, fight among themselves, and cannot even unite behind a single functional leadership structure,
then their disunity is empirical proof that their claims are batil. It's a profound sociological observation.
Because in this framework, truth is inherently a unifying force.
Exactly. Just as the laws of physics don't contradict one another, thermodynamics doesn't randomly fight with electromagnetism.
Right, they work together in the same system.
The laws of a true sociological system must create cohesion. If an ideology inherently breeds sectarianism, infinite subfactions, and systemic chaos, it fails the empirical test. It cannot be hack because a broken engine doesn't produce forward momentum.
I want to pause and make sure we are carrying this concept forward correctly. We are basically saying we should judge political, economic, and social ideologies exactly like we judge a tech startup, aren't we?
That's a great analogy.
We judge it by actual user growth, system stability, and whether the product functions without crashing, rather than the charisma of the CEO's pitch deck.
We are holding sociological claims to the exact same standard as engineering claims. If the bridge collapses, the engineering was false. If the society collapses into civil war and poverty, the ideology was false.
Wow. Okay, so let's map this onto a real-world scenario. Let's say a group actually decodes these sociological laws. They build a productive, cohesive system based on Al-Haq.
They're planting the seeds, the structural rain is falling.
Society is starting to flourish and turn green. But the immediate, unavoidable problem is that the old, unproductive systems, the Batil systems that rely on exploiting the lower classes to maintain elite power, they're going to view this flourishing society as an existential threat.
Oh, inevitably. They will absolutely attack it.
So how does a system built on constructive laws handle violent, destructive hostility?
This is the engine of reason within the framework. It's the protocol for corrective justice and strategic restraint, and it's located in verse 60. The text explicitly states, whoever responds with the like of what was done to him, and then outlines the systemic support for that defender.
Now, on a surface, reading responds with the like of what was done to him sounds identical to Hammurabi's code. An eye for eye. It sounds like primitive revenge.
It does sound like that, but Parwez forcefully argues against reading it as revenge. A systems engineer looks at that phrasing and sees an anti-escalation algorithm.
An anti-escalation algorithm. That's a powerful way to frame it.
It is a precise mathematical rule of corrective justice. The verse explicitly caps retaliation at exact proportionality.
So if a system of hack is attacked, it doesn't have the right to respond with disproportionate annihilating force.
No. It is legally obligated to defend itself, yes, but the response is strictly limited to the exact measure of the offense.
And the systemic logic behind that cap is fascinating, because if you remove the cap, you invite infinite feedback loops.
Exactly.
If a neighboring state skirmishes on your border and you respond by firebombing their capital city, you haven't actually solved the conflict. You've just guaranteed that the next generation of that neighboring state will dedicate their entire existence to destroying you.
Disproportionate retaliation is the exact mechanism that creates endless generational warfare. By capping the response at exact proportionality, the system is designed to absorb the aggressive energy, neutralize the immediate threat, and stop the cycle from continuing.
Stop the loop.
Right. And the verse adds a crucial guarantee. If the defender maintains that strict proportional discipline and is then attacked again out of sheer aggression, the overarching system, the universal law of momentum, will inherently aid the defender.
Wait, how does the system aid them? Is it implying some sort of divine intervention?
Yeah.
Like lightning striking the enemy?
No, not at all. Parwez keeps it entirely sociological.
Okay, so how does it work?
By maintaining the structural integrity of justice, the defending society preserves its internal moral and systemic cohesion. When you lose restraint, when you start committing atrocities in the name of self-defense, you become the very chaos you are fighting.
Your own people start to turn on you.
Your internal cohesion fractures because your citizens realize they are now the bad guys. But if you maintain restraint, you prove the objective superiority of your system.
Which attracts neutral allies.
Yes. It consolidates absolute internal unity and eventually overpowers the aggressor whose own system is fracturing under the weight of its own injustice. The operative concept here is hilum.
Hilla.
Yes, which is a deep, strategic, almost cold-blooded patience and restraint in the face of emotional provocation.
To really understand hilum as a structural tool rather than just a personal virtue, the lecture brings up a massive historical case study from the mid-20th century.
Yes, the India-Pakistan partition era.
Right. Parwez contrasts the strategies of two towering figures in the movement against British colonial rule in India, Mahatma Gandhi and Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who eventually founded Pakistan.
And we should clarify for you listening that Parwez is looking at this purely through the lens of systems engineering. This isn't about political partisanship or taking sides.
It's really structural analysis.
Right. So he analyzes Gandhi's Quit India movement, which was structurally built on the concept of mass civil disobedience. Gandhi's strategy was to instruct the populace to intentionally break the laws of the colonial government to paralyze its operations.
And he invited Jinnah, who led the Muslim League, to join this massive movement of lawbreaking.
And Jinnah flatly refused. He would not participate in civil disobedience, even though he shared the exact same goal of removing the British.
Historically, Jinnah's refusal was often painted as him being overly aristocratic or rigid, or just too tied to British legalism.
But Parwez's systems analysis frames Jinnah's refusal as a masterclass in Hilm. Parwez argued that Jinnah saw civil disobedience as injecting malware into the sociological operating system of the population.
Malware. That is such a vivid way to describe it.
Because Jinnah's logic was long-term. Think about it. If you train a society, millions of people, to routinely and intentionally break the law whenever they are dissatisfied with the government, you are conditioning them to view anarchy as a valid political tool.
You are destroying the concept of the rule of law in the minds of the citizens just to achieve a short-term political victory.
Because Jinnah knew that eventually the British would leave.
And when they left, the local population would have to form their own sovereign state. Parwez points out Jinnah's foresight here. The day after independence, when you try to establish your own constitution, that same society, which you have trained for a decade to burn down infrastructure and ignore police,
they will inevitably deploy those exact same anarchic tactics against your new government the moment they have a grievance.
Wow. That is incredibly prescient.
Jinnah understood that you cannot build a stable, law-bound state with a populace that has internalized lawlessness. The means fundamentally dictate the ends.
So Jinnah's constitutionalism, his insistence on fighting the British through legal frameworks, negotiations, and political leveraging rather than street riots, was an exercise in Hilm.
It is the strategic discipline to endure the slower, more frustrating path of legal resistance to ensure that the foundational integrity of the future society remains intact. You cannot use the tools of batil chaos and emotional reactivity to build a system of hack.
That is a staggering insight for anyone operating within an organization today.
Right.
I mean, we are culturally conditioned to equate reactivity with power.
Oh, absolutely.
Someone attacks you publicly or a competitor plays dirty, and the immediate biological instinct is to escalate, to burn their reputation to the ground, to use their dirty tactics against them. We think unchecked anger is strength.
But this framework argues that reactivity is a system failure. Real power is the immense, calm discipline to focus on the long-term structural goal without compromising your own operating rules just because you were triggered.
Think of it like a controlled burn versus a wildfire. A forester uses a controlled burn to clear dead brush, proportional, managed, goal-oriented.
Reactivity is a wildfire. It might destroy the dead brush, but it takes the entire ecosystem down with it. Hilm allows you to manage conflict without destroying the very ground you plan to build on.
Okay, let me introduce a stress test to this theory, though. Because it's easy to talk about restraint when you have some level of leverage.
Sure.
But what if the environment is fundamentally structurally hostile to Al-Haq? What if you are trying to build this productive society, but the local authorities have completely cut off your resources?
You're cornered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Proportional justice doesn't work because you literally don't have the means to defend yourself. You are locked in a regulatory or physical environment that is explicitly designed to crush you. What is the systems engineering solution when the ecosystem itself is toxic?
When the local environment prevents the implementation of constructive laws, the framework shifts to the spatial dynamics of systemic change. This is addressed in verses 58 and 59 through the concept of hijra.
Hijra, which is almost universally translated as migration or flight. And culturally, it often carries a tone of escaping persecution, right? Like running away into the mountains to hide and preserve your beliefs in secret.
Right. But Parwez aggressively dismantles the idea of hijra as escapism or retreat. In his framework, hiding in a cave to preserve your personal purity while the world burns is fundamentally batil because it produces nothing.
It's inert.
Exactly. Hijra is a highly calculated, strategic spatial relocation. It is moving your assets and your personnel out of a toxic environment to secure a new base of operations where your system can actually scale.
The best modern parallel for this is a tech company trying to build something revolutionary, say, advanced autonomous vehicles or drone delivery grids.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
But they're headquartered in a municipality with incredibly restrictive zoning laws. And you have corrupt local politicians who actively try to shut them down to protect legacy industries, and the infrastructure is terrible.
If they stay and try to fight a losing battle, they deplete all their capital and die.
Exactly. So what do? They don't quit. They pack up their entire operation, engineers and all, and they relocate to a tech hub in a different state or country.
A jurisdiction that offers the infrastructure and regulatory freedom their system needs to deploy.
Right. Hijra is an operational pivot. You leave an environment where the objective laws of social cohesion cannot be implemented in order to actively create a space where they can.
And the lecture brings up the historical Battle of Badr to ground this in reality.
Let's break that down.
So the early community had executed a hijra from Mecca. Mecca was controlled by the Quraysh, which was a powerful mercantile oligarchy that relied on debt slavery and idol worship to maintain economic control.
A system of batil.
Very much so. So the community relocated to Medina to build their system.
And the Quraysh didn't just let them go. They marched on Medina to wipe out the new system before it could become a competing economic and political model.
Right. And the Battle of Bitters is famous because the defending community only had about 313 people, going up against a fully equipped Qurayshi army of roughly 1,000.
And this is where Parwez's sociological lens is crucial, isn't it? Because traditional accounts often rely on narratives of angels descending from the sky to fight alongside the 313.
But Parwez focuses purely on the sociology. How did 313 people defeat a larger, better-equipped force? A victory which then eventually allowed them to expand and dismantle the two global superpowers of the time, the Sassanid Persian Empire and the Byzantine Roman Empire.
It wasn't magic. It was the superiority of their operating system.
Precisely. The Qurayshi army, despite its numbers, was operating on batil. They were a fractured coalition of tribes driven by personal ego, nepotism, and the desire for plunder.
Their command structure was probably chaotic because every tribal leader wanted the glory.
Oh, completely chaotic. The 313 at Badr, however, had implemented the laws of Haqq. They had absolute internal cohesion, a unified command structure based on merit rather than bloodline, and rigorous discipline.
Is it the difference between a 100-watt light bulb and a 100-watt laser?
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
The light bulb is diffuse. It spreads its energy everywhere, illuminating a room but lacking any real impact. A laser takes that exact same amount of energy, organizes the light waves so they are coherent and moving in the exact same direction, and suddenly that 100 watts can cut through solid steel.
The Quraysh were the light bulb. The 313 at Badr were a laser beam. They won because an internally cohesive system based on objective reality is exponentially more powerful than a massive fractured system based on exploitation.
But this struggle relocating, establishing a new society, defending it against overwhelming odds, it requires immense sacrifice. I mean, people die.
Yes, and the text addresses the payoff for this in verses 58 and 59, describing the reward for those who undertake the struggle as husn rizq,
Which translates to excellent provision. And again, if we aren't reading carefully, that sounds like a promise of vast wealth. Like if you fight the good fight, God will give you a mansion and a lot of gold in the afterlife.
Parwez draws a profound distinction between basic animalistic needs and human developmental needs. I mean, if human existence was just about acquiring calories and building a shelter, we would be no different from highly efficient livestock.
Right. A system that only provides baseline survival is incomplete.
Exactly. Husn Rizq is not just about a universal basic income that keeps you alive, but intellectually stagnant.
So what is it?
Excellent provision refers to the higher values. It is the provision of an environment where human potential can be maximized. It's advanced education, cultural richness, intellectual freedom, and the social stability required for continuous human evolution.
And the systemic guarantee Parwez highlights here is almost like the conservation of energy. In physics, energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed.
That's the exact parallel.
In this sociological framework, the text asserts that the human effort put into building a system of Haqq is never lost. Whether a person dies a natural death after decades of slow, unglamorous administrative work, or whether they are killed on the front lines defending the system.
Their contribution is permanently accounted for in the evolutionary progress of humanity. They achieve this excellent provision because they successfully align their individual life force with the objective, forward momentum of the universe.
That is a massive perspective shift for anyone engaged in long-term organizational or societal change.
Yeah.
It completely cures the despair of thinking, if I don't personally live to see the final utopian result, my life was entirely wasted.
You aren't meant to be the roof. You are part of the structural foundation. The building stands because of you.
That's powerful. But let's look at the dark side of the equation for a minute. We've talked about how Haqq inevitably succeeds if it follows the rules. What about the oppressors?
The systems of Batil.
Yeah. What about the systems of the till that seem impenetrable? We look at history or even global politics today, and it often feels like deeply unjust, oppressive regimes can sustain themselves indefinitely. Does this framework offer any objective guarantee that oppressive systems will fail?
It does, actually. And it uses astrophysics as the absolute guarantee of sociological collapse. This brings us to verse 61, which is a brilliant synthesis of the physical and the social.
What does the verse say?
The verse points to the observable mechanical merging of night into day, just as he causes the night to enter the day and the day to enter the night.
So Parwes is using the rotation of the Earth as a metaphor for historical epochs.
Well, it's more than a metaphor. It is an analogy of systemic legibility. Look at the mechanics of the Earth. Because the planet rotates on its axis, it is physically impossible for the night to last forever in any given location.
The sunrise is not a random occurrence.
Yeah.
It is mathematically guaranteed by the astrophysics of the system.
Right. And Parwes argues that in the exact same way, the sociological laws of the universe guarantee that systems based on exploitation, oppression, and falsehood, which are symbolized by darkness, cannot sustain themselves indefinitely.
Why? What is the mechanical reason they must collapse?
Because a system of batil is inherently out of alignment with the fundamental laws of human reality. Humans have an innate developmental need for dignity, equity, and freedom to inquire.
So an oppressive regime has to expend massive, constant amounts of energy to suppress those natural human laws.
Exactly. They have to build massive surveillance states, maintain brutal secret police forces, and constantly disseminate propaganda to keep the population fractured and afraid.
And eventually, the thermodynamic cost of that suppression bankrupts the system. You run out of energy trying to hold down a boiling lid.
The system burns its own fuel, eats its own structural supports, and implodes from within. Its collapse is as mathematically certain as the sunrise, even if we, with our limited human lifespans, cannot predict the exact decade it will happen.
Which brings us to the climax of the source material, verse 66, and what Parwes considers the ultimate fatal contradiction of modern humanity. The verse concludes with a stark observation. Man is indeed ungrateful, using the Arabic word kafur.
And Parwes strips this entirely of its polite interpersonal meaning. Kafur here is not about forgetting to say thank you when someone hands you a gift. It is not about a lack of polite manners toward the divine.
So what is it?
Parwes frames kafur as a catastrophic cognitive failure, is a civilizational paradox. Look at how modern humanity operates. We implicitly trust and rely on the objective, unbreakable laws of the physical world every single second of our lives.
Right, we fly 300-ton metal tubes across the Atlantic Ocean at 600 miles an hour.
We sail massive container ships through storms using satellite navigation based on quantum physics. We grow food for billions of people using precise genetic and chemical sciences.
We reap the massive compounding benefits of a universe that runs on legible, objective laws. We harness the Sakara Lakum we talked about at the very beginning.
Exactly. But then when it comes to the social world, we behave as if the universe has absolutely no rules. We actively deny or ignore the equally objective socioeconomic laws that make sustainable human reality possible.
We accept Bernoulli's principle to keep the airplane in the sky, but we ignore the law of equitable resource distribution on the ground.
We accept thermodynamics, but we ignore the law of proportionate justice. We build our physical infrastructure on absolute truth, but we attempt to build our societal infrastructure on batil, on unchecked greed, exploitation, and tribal ego.
It is the cognitive dissonance of thinking we can cheat the system. We sit inside the hyper-advanced airplane of modern civilization, enjoying the climate control and the Wi-Fi, while simultaneously ripping out the wiring and tearing up the floorboards because we convince ourselves that the laws of aerodynamics somehow don't apply to the social hierarchy inside the cabin.
That is the perfect way to put it. That is the essence of kafur. It is civilizational ingratitude. It is the profound arrogance of believing that our mastery over the physical world somehow exempts us from the sociological laws that govern human survival.
It's incredibly dangerous.
Parwes's warning is dire. A civilization that operates this way is structurally unstable. You simply cannot sustain technological mastery on a foundation of sociological falsehood. Eventually, the internal friction of the batil society will cause it to turn its advanced, physically law-bound technology against itself.
So as we synthesize this immense arc we've traveled today, what is the core blueprint? We started with the premise that reason is designed to harness the universe. Nature is a system to be decoded, not feared.
Right, and we learn that the truth of an ideology is measured empirically by the flourishing it produces in the real world, the dead earth turning green.
We saw that maintaining that system requires the mathematical discipline of proportionate justice, the hilm to resist emotional reactivity, and the strategic foresight to relocate when the environment becomes completely toxic.
And finally, we saw that the ultimate civilizational failure, Kafur, is using the immense leverage of the physical world while squandering it through a willful, arrogant ignorance of the social laws.
A society that reads nature's laws, both physical and sociological, and builds in alignment with them, flourishes.
But a society that mistakes its own inert idols, whether those idols are literal statues or modern concepts of unchecked greed and ego for power, well, it forfeits the very leverage that made it strong in the first place.
It is an incredibly sobering lens, and I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. We live in an era where humanity has achieved near godlike mastery over the physical laws of the universe.
We have literally subjected the earth, the sea, and the sky to our engineering.
We hold the source code to the physical world in our hands, but by continuously ignoring the objective structural laws of human justice, equity, and restraint, are we, at the absolute height of our technological supremacy, committing the ultimate civilizational ingratitude?
It's a heavy question.
Will our brilliant mastery of physics ultimately be undone by our profound ignorance of sociology? Think back to that ancient blueprint hanging on the wall. We've plugged the machine in, the engines are humming with immense world-altering power. But are we about to crash the entire system simply because we refuse to read the chapter on how human beings are supposed to interact with it?
That isn't just an abstract philosophical question anymore.
No, it's not. According to this framework, that is the single most urgent engineering problem of our time.